And with that, I think we are ready. So, Mr. McCoy, thank you for deferring. And until tomorrow, and Mr. Robinson, it is yours.
Would you raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes. Good evening. My name is William Paul Robinson. I am Research Director at Southwest Research and Information Center here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I had been asked by several groups called Aguas Vida Water Team, the Water Groups, and Citizens for Alternatives for Radioactive Dumping to prepare a technical statement for this proceeding. I have filed that statement electronically with the hearing clerk and also provided it to the parties as requested. And that statement includes my resume and the references cited in that statement. By way of brief background, I have a master's degree from University of New Mexico from the Community and Regional Planning Program in 1992 with a professional project planning for reclamation of the uranium mines and mills of the former East Germany. I have just received notice of a paper that I'm a co-author of being published in Environmental Science and Technology, just announced yesterday, on characterization of the contents of mine waste. In my resume, there's examples of Environment Department Hazardous Waste Bureau hearings that I've appeared in as an expert, both proposed facilities and inactive facilities needing decommissioning and cleanup activities, and have had publications in peer-reviewed journals as well as many contract publications, and I'll leave that brief, leave the summary of my experience that brief, except to note that I did participate in the 1991 Sandia RCRA permit hearing and the 2004 mixed waste landfill corrective measure hearing before preparing for this proceeding.
Before you get to your slideshow, so as Exhibit 1, you have given us your CV and your written testimony. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and you offer that for admission at this time?
I do.
Okay. Any objection? Objection. Okay, with no objection, it is so admitted.
So just to begin, a previously unidentified plume of contaminants of concern has been detected at the mixed waste landfill in the last year. It is not a new plume. There were questions in the rebuttal statements that asserted that I had was describing a new plume. It was previously unidentified. I did not say new. And it's the new dimensions of this previous identified plume that are of particular importance. This plume is composed of volatile organic compounds that have been detected as deep as 400 feet. There was no testing for volatile organic compounds at the depth below 50 feet in the history of the mixed waste landfill. So that additional depth of sampling generated results that showed the occurrence of 2 volatile organic compounds, and that is evidence of a release from the mixed waste landfill, in my opinion. The landfill received waste between 1959 and the late 1980s. The waste was received in various forms, which would not be considered appropriate containers in modern waste management practices. I don't know, Mr. Hearing Officer, if you've reviewed some of the pictures in the 2004 hearing, but the open trenches, scientists in the 1950s, white shirts, black ties, dropping plastic bags in the trench, piles of bags, just informal disposal in soft containment characterizes much of the waste at the site. In looking at the inventory, which has been discussed at length and has been identified in the record many times, there are very few, if any, items identified which could be understood as the sources of the volatile organic compounds. The volatile organic compounds, PCE and TCE, to use their short names, are typically used as solvents in cleaning. And so you don't see solvents, cleaning fluids, things like that listed. There's much more attention to the radioactive elements that occur than the organics. But I don't believe that there is a question that the volatile organic compounds that have been detected below the landfill came from the landfill. But there is no estimate of the amount of those chemicals that can be generated based on the inventory. And because there's an uncertain amount of these chemicals, and the containers that they're in have provide poor containment, it's unclear how much of either TCE or PCE was in the landfill or has leaked, and it's unclear whether all of the TCE has leaked, whether all of the containers have leaked, whether they're plastic bags that might be penetrated or biodegrade, if there's other materials above that, say some of the wood boxes that are in, if they decay and lose their strength and those collapse and things fall on top of other things, it may be that the compaction done at the top of the landfill did not cause further damage to the soft containers in the landfill, but those containers are likely to continue to deteriorate over time. Some of those containers are almost as old as I am, and I've certainly deteriorated since 1959. So the problem of how much is there and whether it's contained or not, I think are very serious problems. As we know, there's no liner underneath the landfill, so there's no bottom to catch or any treatment to the bottom which might attenuate or adsorb or absorb the volatile organics. So I think that this data that we have heard discussed many times and is included in my testimony is very important new data. And as others have said, and I certainly agree, it was generous of the permittee to provide the data that we've been discussing because they did not have a clear responsibility, but it was very much appreciated and very valuable. So the let's move to the slides. Let's see if we can get the slide on. That's good enough. So so based on this occurrence of a plume at the depth of 400 feet of a volatile organic compound, which was released from the landfill, I believe that the corrective action at the mixed waste landfill cannot properly be considered complete, and that should not be considered complete unless and until this newly detected plume is fully characterized and a corrective action plan developed and implemented for this plume. And that the consideration of the corrective action as complete with controls petition should be deferred until the corrective action for the newly detected VOC plume is completed. And additional actions that I recommend to characterize the plume include connecting some of the geologic dots between the various drill points at the site and doing some cross-sectional views, and also extending the monitoring system vertically and horizontally to try and define the extent of the plume. Next slide. So this slide uses the long name of our two friends, PCE and TCE, tetrachloroethene and trichloroethene, as well as total volatile organics are the constituents analyzed in the September and October 2014 data that I'm concerned with. Next slide. Next slide. That's just a map that locates things. It's the same map there. Now this slide, this is the same image as we see to the hearing officer's right behind the camera. This is an image from one of the posters provided by the permittee at a public information meeting. And the image in the center on the bottom is what I want to focus on. That's a cross-sectional sketch of the mixed waste landfill. And it shows where the boreholes used for monitoring wells are, where the boreholes used for VOC monitoring, where the soil moisture monitoring occurs. There's not much detail provided on that figure of what's between the bottom of the trenches and the water table. And it's filling in that detail, which I think is necessary and appropriate for this site using the existing lithological data and other techniques that may be available. So let's go to the next slide. This is image that on the slide 6, on the left side, that's a schematic view of the wells used to identify the soil vapor that's been detected. And there's two quotes from the long-term monitoring and maintenance plan where the goals of this soil vapor monitoring in that plan are to determine volatile organic compound soil vapor concentrations in the subsurface above the water table and monitor over time, and that two previous studies showed volatile organic soil vapor concentrations are very low to a depth of 50 feet below ground surface. There was no data below 50 feet at the time of any of the decision making that was being reviewed today. Next slide. Now this is the data from the soil vapor wells that I've compiled, and this is also included in exhibits from the Environment Department. I've included the actual reports that I received, as did the Environment Department. The So one of the things that I found was that the concentrations of volatile organics were higher at greater depth. If you look, for example, at the SVO1 and 2, which go down to 40 feet, you find about a half a part per million for the PCE at 1 and 0.086 in the other well. And then as you go looking at SVO3, you can see that the 50-foot depth is has less PCE than the 400-foot depth. It's about a third. The 50-foot level has about a third of the amount detected at 400 feet. In SVO4, the difference is not as striking. It's about 50% higher at 400 rather than 50. And for SVO5, it's about 3 times higher. So there is an increase from the shallow to the deeper. Now, as I believe it's Mr. Mitchell mentioned in his rebuttal, there's some higher levels at the 200-foot depth, which you see, for example, in SVO4, where the 200-foot is higher than the 400-foot depth. And at SVO5, the 400-foot is higher than the 200. And at SVO3, the 400 is higher than the 200. So I think that the data speaks for itself in terms of it being higher at lower depths than had been previously sampled. So this is new data that defines a release. There is a nominal 100 feet from the 400-foot depth to what's been described as the water table. As Mr. Moats made clear in his testimony and his experience, the depth to water has increased. A nominal 40 feet, I believe he mentioned. So there's a depth from 400 to 460 before one would reach a previous water table where there might be different geochemical characteristics, since it was a saturated zone, rather than the, though it is no longer saturated, rather than the vadose zone, which has never been saturated but may carry water and have some perch zones. So that distance between 400 and 500 is quite important. I believe it's certainly reasonable and appropriate to investigate the VOC concentrations there as part of the characterization of the plume that still doesn't have a bottom yet. Next slide, please. Now, this is a slide that I inserted because it relates to the conversation I had with Mr. Mitchell during cross-examination of his, while he was a witness. And this is the detected volatile organic compounds as reported in the long-term monitoring and maintenance plan report that was just made available in June. It's not been, I don't believe it's been introduced in the record as a full report, but it is available on the ED Sandia webpage, and I believe that ED staff had said they hadn't completed their review of the document, which is 500 or 600 pages, I forget which. And so this data, this is the one table that presents volatile organic groundwater data. And as we discussed during the examination, the results show tetrachloroethylene and trichloroethylene, both TCE and PCE, occurring above the MDL minimum detection level, but below the PQL, the practical quantification limit. and also below the trigger level, which is approximately 7 times the amount detected. So in the discussion with Mr. Mitchell, I believe he agreed that this demonstrated groundwater occurrence of this chemical, which is considered a contaminant, so it's contamination. It's not confirmed very extensively, but it is an indication that this stuff may be here. In my review of other literature on the mixed waste landfill, there is a June 5, 2009 split sample report from NMED, also on the Bureau's Sandia webpage, which summarizes data from mixed waste landfill wells where the department split samples. And MW8, which is the monitoring well that is listed as showing a detection of these organics, was also shown to have a detection of those organics in that well. And it also had the J notification, which means between the minimum detection limit and the practical quantification limit. So it's occurred, but so low as to be difficult to confirm. As I understood Mr. Motz's testimony, the state's of the opinion that this is too low to worry about, and that it's not a risk in itself, and that it's not at a high enough level to exceed the standard, which is twice the trigger level. And he based his statement on his calculation, as we discussed on the record, and as his exhibit shows, using standard calculations. And he found that if the volatile organic compounds were below the 0.6 or 0.8 microgram per liter, which is parts per billion, then they were not likely to have potential to cause contamination. If the vapor gas in these, let me begin again. If the vapor gas concentrations found in the, above the water table were below the thresholds he identified in his report by calculation at about the 0.5 or 0.6 microgram per liter, then those concentrations in the soil vapor could not exceed the standard in the water table. However, I don't believe there's any reason to think that these two sets of samples from September and October from just these 3 wells define the full extent of the plume, and that the state is considering an approach which would not investigate the extent of the plume and would prejudge whether the plume has a wider aerial or vertical extent or exceeds the numbers that have been detected. And I believe that that's inappropriate, and since the release has occurred, it's the state's responsibility to enforce regulations that require the identification and correction of those plumes, and it's the permittee's responsibility to fully characterize and correct those plumes. And so the data here, and as I believe Mr. Mitchell mentioned, the subsequent sampling at this location did not show the detects at this level that reached the minimum detection limit. So there's several implications that I draw from that. One, it's possible, perhaps, that this is a plume that has been moving at a rate so that it's just reaching the groundwater. There's been no investigation to determine the rate of movement that is demonstrated by the data. The fate and transport model was a what are any and all of the options, considering all of the variables, what could happen. I think a fate and transport model, a little more focused on the actual parameters of the site, would be valuable and worth including in a corrective action investigation and plan. Now, this plume may be 30 years old. It may be 50 years old. Some of the bags from 1959 might have broken, and that's when the first VOCs moved. It could be my daughter's birthday, January 2nd, 1984, 25 years after the stuff was put in and something happened inside and the bag broke. So it's unclear when the plume began. And there may be multiple containers with TCE, so one that had a small amount that might have generated a plume under one trench and caused a show in 94 or 2004 or 2008. Well, that may not be the only plume because the materials put in the landfill were not put in one place and not homogenized. There's a series of trenches, there's a series of pits, they're a couple of 100 yards apart, and the monitoring points are a couple of 100 yards apart. So there's no basis for assuming that there's just a single plume and a single plume possible, or a single plume has been defined. Next slide, please. Now, this is a conceptual model for the volatile organic plume at the chemical waste landfill. And this is from the corrective measure study for that facility, also posted on the Bureau's Sandia page, and I've provided a citation to the record. And this is an example of a cross-sectional view which shows indications of the geologic materials and the distribution of the volatile organic compounds and some of the characteristics of those distributed chemicals. And we have nothing like this for the mixed waste landfill VOC plume. So this is one of the types of things that I think is appropriate to see produced, to require and have the permittee to produce as part of a corrective action investigation, which would need to be done before any corrective action complete determination was made. Now, it is certainly true, as Mr. Mitchell mentioned, and the staff, I think, also mentioned, that the concentrations at the chemical waste landfill, particularly in that middle range. Next slide, please. This is slide 10, has the same picture I've been discussing on the upper part. On the lower right, this is the VOC plume, shown in a little different time period. And the colors represents a gradient from 1 up to 50 part per million. So the red part of the plume, that's 50 parts per million. We're talking about a half a part per million. So we're talking about a much lower concentration, but we're also talking about chemicals that have occurred 30, 50 years after emplacement. So they're quite persistent. They're quite persistent. So in the mixed waste landfill situation, as noted in my statement, the mixed waste landfill had groundwater occurrences of exceeding the maximum contaminant limit for TCE. This is on page 8 of my testimony, and it's quoted from the fact sheet that the Environment Department distributed in January to introduce the subject matter of this hearing. And it said that the TCE was detected in groundwater exceeding the EPA maximum concentration, maximum contaminant level. And as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking there may be a typo because what I have listed is 5 micrograms per liter. This, the 0.005 parts per million is 5 parts per billion. And so what we have at the new data at 400 feet is about a half a part per million. So cleanup was conducted at the chem waste landfill when the standard was exceeded. And it was a voluntary corrective measure. And here we have data that shows that it's about 18 or 20% of the triggered level and about 8% of the standard. So, shall we wait until the standard is exceeded to take action? Do we want to pollute up to the limit? Or is detection of a release 400 feet down, indication that it may have reached groundwater, is that enough for an additional corrective action? That's the key question as I see it. Now, as Mr. Motz's testimony made clear, the long-term monitoring and maintenance plan was approved before the soil vapor monitoring wells were installed. They were sort of given a little bit of a variance. Okay, you can install those later. We'll approve it now. I don't know if detecting these volatile organics at 400 feet would have made more of an impression before the plan was completed, was approved. But I believe that it is particularly compelling data, and it is of the hazardous chemicals that the state has clear authority to regulate. It is a release. The release has grown based on the data, so I think corrective action is certainly appropriate. Next slide. Now, just for completeness, these are some of the cross-section, some of the information about the cross-sections to the organic chemical contamination at the Kirtland Air Force Base bulk fuels terminal. And the different pictures show the cross-section of the plume at 50-foot sections as one goes down. And next slide. Next slide. And these show a vertical cross-section from the surface to the water table. And so these horizontal cross-sections looking at the aerial extent, vertical cross-sections looking at the horizontal extent. I think that these are certainly standard methods to characterize plumes and are certainly within the capabilities of the lab staff. They may not even need to use consultants for doing this. They may have staff of their own. Now, this last picture that shows the cross-sections of the Kirtland base fuel show that there's quite a wide range of concentrations. There's not a simple geometry to the plumes, and that reflects the geochemistry of the soil that is being penetrated. It's not a homogeneous media. And if we go back up a few slides, we'll get to the chem waste landfill. You're doing right. Yeah, up. Keep going. Here we can see that the lithology, the geologic materials encountered, that they have a lot to do with the dimensions of the plume. And so I think that that's worth, those are some of the benefits of the additional characterization that I'm asked for. And extracting soil vapors is currently being demonstrated at the bulk fuel terminals. It is not a new technology. Extracting volatile organic compounds from water is a very different problem than extracting from the soil. So trying to catch the plume, trying to remove as much of the plume before it reaches the groundwater or the area that had been saturated and may have different geologic conditions than the unsaturated vadose zone. I think that that's a particularly important goal of corrective action for this particular plume, which has come from this site and contains chemicals for which there's no question that the state has regulatory authority. So I would like to conclude by just responding to a couple of the comments made in rebuttal, if I may. So one of the comments that was of concern related to the Environment Department witness who testified that the landfill was constructed as designed, that the corrective measure was implemented properly. As the witness mentioned, she had not been involved previously in the evaluation or development of the corrective measure and was reviewing to determine if the as-built reflected the design. And one of the examples of a evapotranspiration cover that she mentioned was an alternative landfill cover demonstration. Now, alternative landfill cover demonstration project is one that I have some experience with. I was on a committee with one of Dr. Dinwiddie's dissertation committee members as part of a Department of Energy EPA review program. And that alternative landfill cover demonstration is, of course, a Sandia project. And one of the main actors in the project is a Graham Inc. staff member. And this was done by, led by a fellow named Steve Dwyer, and was a very hot item in the late 90s and early 2000s. And, but that project ran out of money. And so the 5-year performance reports from that landfill cover have never been made available. They haven't been published, identified, distributed. 2003 there is when the EPA report on the evaluation of alternative covers called Evapotranspiration Landfill Cover System Fact Sheet. And that fact sheet identifies, among other things, that the HELP model is not an appropriate model to use for ET covers because they don't account for percolation properly. And the Evapotranspiration Landfill Cover Systems fact sheet identifies other defects or weaknesses in ET covers as a design matter. So we did not, so what I'm trying to communicate with this discussion, and I will make this document available, even though it's a public document, readily available, is that the cover may not have been designed according to proper methods, and the model for the cover has not been evaluated for a 5-year period, much less the life of the need of the performance measures. One can see the alternative landfill cover demonstration site just north of the chem waste landfill. There's a series of parcels, rectangular in shape, which were treated with different covers and were evaluated. Well, now you can watch the tumbleweeds grow. You can see whether they have been maintained, whether there's still vegetation or not. And it's the deterioration of the cover that is the fatal flaw in this soil cover. And we're dependent on the perpetual capacity of the institutions to monitor and maintain, as opposed to any engineering or physical properties that serve as barriers to movement. As many witnesses have made clear, the cover does not do anything to attenuate the volatile organics. Volatile organics are heavier than air, so they sink in the air that is in the pore spaces between the sand grains in the vadose zone. And so the moisture content doesn't have anything to do with it. And so for these particular classes of compound, the cap provides very little functional value. And this is the chemical compound for which there is the clearest evidence of release and substantial distribution of that released chemical. When I first started listening to Sandia staff and contractors talk about the mixed waste landfill, one of the major concerns about exposure, were it to be excavated, was tritium. And this was in the mid to late 90s when I was on the site-specific advisory board that Sandia had created. Well, the half-life of tritium is 12.3 years, so we're about 2 more half-lives down the road. So the reduction of the tritium content, which is much more predictable than the dissipation of the volatile organic compound, that potential risk has reduced substantially. And that might, potential worker risk was one of the concerns raised related to excavation. Ms. Dare also mentioned that some of the evaluations, including assessing rainfall that might be 9 times as high as now. Well, 9 times is a magic number because that fits the evapotranspiration number, the amount of water evaporated off of a surface. So as long as the rainfall is less than the evaporation, you've got a net evaporation setting. So if you talk about climate change and think the rainfall is going to change and take a extreme number 9 times, as long as it's just under the other, there's still some evaporation. However, if during that climate change there's more rainfall, therefore there's more clouds, then therefore there's less evapotranspiration. So if there were enough weather out there to generate 80 inches of rain, we're talking Hawaii, we could go observe the site, be worth the site visit, we would certainly have a much lower evapotranspiration if the rainfall rose a more modest amount, 10, 20 inches. We would still see a reduction in the ET, but not a gross change. So I don't believe that the factors that might be impinging on a cover, particularly an ET cover that's wholly designed for climatic conditions, I don't think they've been very well evaluated, or certainly not very well communicated by the witness. Mr. Moats found that 2 data points for volatile organic compounds were not sufficient to make strong determinations about a plume, and that they were low enough that they would not cause a exceedance based on his Henry's Law calculation. And I think it's 2 data points are premature for making that definitive of a conclusion. I have engaged in many conversations with Mr. Moats. I appreciate his experience and his knowledge. And, but I do think that the state should be deferring action until there's considerably more data and analysis of the data and the extent of the plume before determining that there's not enough in that plume to cause an unacceptable risk. Certainly it's a contaminant, certainly it's been released. The last thought I want to leave with are some of the thoughts from the previous hearing officer in her report, which is the Sandia, DOE Sandia Exhibit 9, and I'm looking at page 39, and in the middle of the page, hearing officer Pruitt wrote, many of the issues initially raised by Resnikoff and Robinson were answered and explained by later NMED witnesses, additional Sandia testimony and research, and uncontroverted evidence that the groundwater had not been contaminated under the mixed waste landfill. It will be particularly important to identify appropriate triggers specifically aimed at the protection of groundwater. For example, one trigger would be that if contaminants moved a specific distance deeper under the landfill, this might result in NMED ordering future excavation. Now, I have no way of knowing whether this contaminant has moved to 400 foot of depth since the hearing in December of 2004. But it is certainly deeper than has been detected. And that might result in NMED ordering future excavation because of the plume that's been detected. Had that trigger been used rather than a quantitative trigger, we might have a different perception. So I think that with that, I'll end my direct statement. I appreciate your patience, Mr. Hearing Officer, and I appreciate the time of all the witnesses and parties. Thank you.
Okay, let's go ahead and go to cross-examination. I am going to ask parties to be brief. Dr. Nutter.
So, Paul, what is your conclusion with regard to the likelihood, if you can make one at this point, that given the shape of the curve and the fact that there's more down deep than shallow, with regard to future release behavior?
Interesting question. We haven't benefited from enough investigation of the plume to try and provide any dating of the release or the rate of mobility. We don't know if it's reached 400 feet in 1963, it only took 4 years and has just been detected. It may have been a release caused by a failure of a bag. So it's very hard to tell. But the idea that there's higher concentrations at depth relative to shallow wells, to me, indicates it's likely that much of the plume has already moved past the shallower reaches. This is certainly one of the characteristics of the Kirtland plume, where the release has reached all the way to the water table and spread, as opposed to just begun. So it's an old, mature plume rather than a young, beginning plume. And I think the dynamics of those are quite different and are appropriate to consider. The fate and transport model, as I remember, looked at a range of 5 to 70 kilograms of volatile organics as the source term, and I don't know whether that's a very accurate estimate. So running a source term of that amount, getting to the concentration that we now find, that would let us know how long it's taken. But there is certainly volatile organic compounds lower than 400 feet that have not been identified. And so that is part of the plume that is getting closer to the groundwater, which is a key resource to protect. So is that responsive to your question?
Yes, it was. A couple of questions related on the horizontal distribution. I'm not familiar with those diagrams that you had. Is there adequate measurement horizontally at different points to assure that we're not having localized places that are going down and we're missing? Are we getting, what do you think about the horizontal?
Let's go back to that one that has the top, up near the top, just the cross-section of the mixed waste landfill.
Right.
So there's no information in the corrective measure plans or the long-term monitoring and maintenance plan that characterizes the subsurface environment. One more up. Yeah. And so we only have those boreholes shown in that picture, which are the monitoring wells and the soil vapor wells and the angle wells for soil moisture to work with, to characterize what's going on underground and how widespread horizontally the plume is. So there probably are more sampling points needed unless there's an effort to try and refit these soil vapor wells with horizontal or directional drilling features, which would allow expansions out from the 50 and 200 foot and other sampling ports.
Would you have faith in the concept of beginning to try to model the phenomena that we're seeing in a temporal fashion?
I think that modeling based on the parameters at the site, rather than the Monte Carlo
right.
approach,
That's what I'm talking
is
about.
appropriate and necessary, and certainly within the capacity of the permittee to generate.
I think it would be useful if you made some observations and recommendations with regard to what you perceive would be appropriate direction with regard to the modeling timing, because it's not far from the 5-year review, and it would be nice to have the model up and or model interpretations available at the time of the 5-year review.
I'm assuming that's a suggestion, not a question, though, right?
I'm asking, does that make sense?
That seems
It is
wise.
sort of a question.
And you received an answer. I stand corrected.
And I didn't hear your answer, I'm sorry.
Seems wise, seems appropriate to do. Long overdue, actually.
Right. So is that something you would be willing to do?
somebody hired me to do that, I would enjoy working on that.
Well, no, I meant just make the suggestion, because I assume that Sandia is in charge of doing.
Well, I've made several suggestions as to characterization and cross-sections and updating the model to reflect current data, so I agree. Yes, that's appropriate.
Yeah, well, maybe all that we really need is just that in the record. The hearing record, Sandia will read. Mr. Ho, Dr. Ho will read.
I guess I'm confused, that he's willing, if hired.
No, I'm saying that maybe it's enough that we have it in the record, in the hearing record here today, so that Mr. Ho, as he looks at future modeling, or he or his equivalent.
I will tell you, it's not in the written testimony, it's not in his pre-filed testimony, so I would reserve that, because that's not part of what he, part of his direct testimony either, is recommendation, so I think that is outside the scope.
But it was my understanding, was it yours, Paul, that Mr. Ho is going to continue to do modeling?
I have no idea. But the idea of characterizing the plume and the rate of movement, that's what modeling does.
And,
right.
So
and I've understood that testimony already.
But not
Yeah.
a direct reference to Mr. Ho as the,
Just one.
Dr. Ho is the likely.
Just one last thought that ties to what Mr. Motes was saying about his Henry Law calculations and so on. Assuming that there's no more release because it's lower up there, if all of that comes down, it presumably, all the TCE goes to the groundwater, it presumably isn't enough to contaminate the groundwater to MCL, is that true?
I don't, it might be true. I don't think we have very comprehensive information on the extent of the plume and whether we see peak values. If we go to the slide down a few with the values presented, keep going. We see the highest values are for SVO1 at 42 feet, 0.56, and total organics over 1 part per million by volume. So is that a new wave, or is that a residual of an old wave? All the other numbers are well below that half a part per million figure. And there's only those 2 soil vapor holes within the perimeter of the landfill. The permittee was loath to penetrate the landfill with borings. And so there's not much idea. There are certainly methods for horizontal borings to get a much more comprehensive view of the volatile organic distribution at whatever depth one chooses, 10 feet, 15 feet, 50 feet. So there would be a grid of monitoring points rather than just the single point that's only attainable with a vertical boring. And as many know, Sandia has developed a lot of the horizontal boring technology used in environmental monitoring and hydrocarbon extraction.
So is your conclusion that there's enough monitoring wells or not enough?
I don't think that there's enough to comprehensively characterize the plume at the shallow depth or at the depth below 400 feet or outside the perimeter, since there must be volatile organics outside the wells in order to have something occur in a well. It's not going to be zero just outside it. So there's not enough data to do that. But there is enough data to do some of the cross-section lithological analysis, some of the initial modeling that would give much more information than is currently available. And I don't think that that would be done if the corrective action was determined to be complete
Okay, thank you.
Mr. McCoy?
Thank you for that presentation. You were present at Fate and Transport hearings, meetings with the New Mexico Environment Department, right? And those occurred back in the period kind of after the final order was adopted. Is that, you recall that?
Mm-hmm.
Is that yes?
Yes.
At that time, one of the things that I was new to citizen action, but you had worked quite a bit with Sue Dayton, and one of the
Say that again, please.
I'm sorry.
Repeat your question.
At that time, you had worked with Sue Dayton, who was a former director of Citizen Action, and one of the things that you had wanted to get was the tech law report. Is that correct? In relation to the Fate and Transport model?
Yes.
And were you able to get it at that time?
No.
Would it?
I'm sorry, but I don't know what you said. What's the word?
He asked if I wanted to get the tech law report. I said yes. Did I get it? I said no.
Okay, thanks.
So it was later obtained in about the 2009 period. Did you read the tech law report?
No.
Oh, okay. All right. But you were not able to obtain it at the time.
No, my strategy at the time was to encourage the state to hold a public meeting with tech law there so we could hear what their people said since we couldn't get the report. And so that meeting provided some insights into some of the tech law staff's perceptions.
Are you familiar with the terminology flute wells?
Yes,
Are these flute wells that they've been using?
yes.
Have you seen any material that indicates that the flute wells are ineffective for soil gas monitoring below the depth of 50 feet, that they're not considered accurate? They're more a low-level type of sampling rather than going down to deeper levels. Have you seen material to that effect?
No.
I don't have any more questions.
Thank you. Sandia, do we? Thanks, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Robinson.
Good evening.
First, let me say I appreciate your testimony, and the reason is I felt like you stuck to new issues rather than visiting old ones, and so that was refreshing. Now, I want to start with your testimony here at page 3. Do you have that before you?
Did you say his testimony?
His testimony, yes.
Yes, I do.
Third paragraph, you say, based on this newly identified release from the MWL, right? And I wasn't clear if in your verbal testimony here today you were backing off of the idea that this was a newly identified release. Do you still stand by that testimony?
Yes. And as I mentioned in my direct and showed from the slide, that the state was only talking about VOCs at low levels down to 50 feet. So this is newly identified relative to that.
The location
depth.
of the plume is new, right? You have more information about it.
Well, that I think that the difference between data at 50 feet and at 400 feet and the distance between, that's newly identified, and that plume was not acknowledged.
There was information in the phase, during the RFI process about VOCs beneath the mixed waste landfill, right?
Yes. But that was that shallow depth, and it's the newly identified at depth that I think is the striking and new aspect to the plume.
So it's the depth of it that you believe is new.
The confirmation of the depth,
The confirmation of the RFI data.
no. The RFI had no data below 50 feet and did not speculate as to how deep the VOCs went.
Understood. So in other words, we knew about VOCs beneath the mixed waste landfill during the RFI process at a depth of, I believe it was 30 feet, right? You're nodding, is that correct?
Yes.
And now we have more data via the LTMMP that says there are VOCs down to a depth of 400 feet below ground surface. Is that right?
That data not only identifies 12 times greater depth, it identifies a much wider horizontal distribution relative to the RFI data as well.
More is known about the VOCs beneath the mixed waste landfill, right?
Yes.
Okay. I've handed you what's been marked as a DOE Sandia Exhibit 25. Do you have that before you?
I do.
And have you had an opportunity to see the MWL Annual Long-Term Monitoring and Maintenance Report?
The June 2015, the one that just came out?
Well, if you see in the upper right-hand corner, it's got a date of April 2014 through March 2015. It is
that's the report that came out June, and it covers this April to
Correct.
March date, and it came out in June.
Yes, and have you seen that?
Yes.
Do you recognize this page from that report?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd move the admission of DOE Sandia Exhibit 25.
Objection? No, with no objection, it is admitted.
My understanding from your testimony, Dr. Robinson, is that you're saying that the concentrations are getting greater the further you get down in the soil?
I have some friends who call me Dr. Robinson, but I only have a master's degree.
So, well, I'm trying to elevate your education. You're not cooperating, I'll let you know.
Well, I wouldn't want Mr. Rose to find out about that.
Mr. Robinson, am I correctly understanding your testimony?
Yes.
Can you identify on this Sandia DOE Exhibit 25 the maximum concentrations that are shown?
Well, for the 50 to 400 foot wells, the maximum concentration for SVO3 is at the 400 foot level for PCE in both September and October, TCE in both TCE, the 400-foot depth is 3 times the 50-foot depth. So for each of the deep wells, the 50-foot is lower than the 400-foot.
We must be looking at a different chart, Mr. Robinson. If I look at this whole thing and I say, what's the maximum concentrations that was sampled in September, October for any of these VOCs, I see a figure of 0.560 in the upper left-hand corner for the first soil vapor monitoring well. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. And what depth is that at?
That's at 42 feet.
Uh-huh.
And I testified and wrote about the difference in the 3 wells that have the 50 to 400.
Well, now you're answering a different question,
that's why I'm referring
right?
to those in my testimony.
Let's not talk over each other, please.
Yeah, so that's a different question. But you would agree with me that the maximum concentrations there are at that highest level, right?
At the shallowest depth, yes.
Do you see anywhere on here at the 400-foot level a value that is greater than 0.560?
No, and I have not made no representations regarding those being higher.
Let's look at soil vapor monitoring well 3. And so at the 200-foot below ground surface level, you see a 0.3 reading, right?
Correct. For September for PCE.
For September for PCE. And then you do see at 400 feet, you see 0.390, correct?
Correct.
Which is 0.09 greater, which is
Correct.
in parts per million per volume, right?
Correct.
Now, if you move down to the 2014, September 2014 for PCE for the soil vapor monitoring well 4, what is the concentration at the 200-foot level?
180.
0.18.
Yeah, 0.1.8. 0.180, correct.
What is it at 400?
0.110.
You'll agree with me that that's less than at the 200-foot level, right?
But I would not agree with you that it is less than at the 50-foot level, and all I said was that it was higher at 400 feet than at 50 feet.
Yes, Mr. Robinson, I understand. I'm
Okay.
just asking, my question is, you'll agree with me that it is lower at 400 feet than at 200 feet?
Yes.
For soil vapor monitoring well number 5, what is the value you see for the 200-foot level?
The same relationship occurs at that well.
Yeah, will you agree with me that that same relationship agrees at every single other sampling point besides the soil vapor monitoring well 3 for September?
Yes.
So the highest concentrations are actually at 200 feet.
Yes, but I did not make any representations regarding where the highest concentrations were. I had read the data before, and I'm trying to show that the levels at greater depth are higher than at shallower depth. Now, as you notice...
But you'll agree with me that 200 is shallower than 400, right?
Well, I would agree that it's vastly deeper than any previous data. But
Yeah.
it is certainly a lower number and shallower.
And gentlemen, I also
No.
have this, so I can
Yeah.
look at
No.
the numbers.
And I'd like to add, if I may, that in the chem waste landfill cross sections that I showed, it appears to have higher concentrations at the 200-foot depth than lower. So that would be a very important characteristic to know more about in the characterization and modeling of the site.
I think we'll get a chance to look at those cross sections. When you were talking, I understood one of the things you say that it's important that we capture the contaminants and at a time we're able to fix it rather than when the groundwater standards are exceeded, right?
Yes.
And that strikes me as a very good idea. Are you familiar with the LTMMP?
Yes.
Do you have before you the DOE Sandia exhibits? And I'm interested in turning you to Exhibit 21,
I do.
page 5-2.
Sorry, 21?
Exhibit 21, page 5-2.
Thank you.
I have that before me.
The schematic here shows it's a schematic for what happens with the long-term monitoring and maintenance plan, right?
That's titled Trigger Evaluation Process for the Mixed Waste Landfill.
Okay, so let's look at that process. So you do sampling under the LTMMP, right?
Yes.
And then we have trigger levels that have been established, right?
Yes.
And then if those trigger levels are established, and you understand those trigger levels are established at a level that's less than the standard, right?
Yes.
Then you resample to confirm the result. Does that strike you as a good idea?
Well, the previous line strikes me as a problematic idea, but moving on to this one, yes, that resampling does sound like a good idea.
see if trigger levels have been exceeded?
It's a bad idea to have trigger levels at 50% of a standard because you have got a lot of contamination by then as opposed to at a point of detection.
Mr. Robinson, the trigger levels were established as part of the CMI plan, right?
Yes.
There were comments on the CMI plan, right? There was an opportunity to comment.
Yes.
You
I don't
commented.
know if there were any comments on the CMI plan. There was an opportunity to comment. I did not comment.
Well, I think we can take a look and see if that's correct. You certainly compiled comments, right?
On the CMI plan,
Yes.
I don't recall, but it may be. That was a lot more recent than the 2004 hearing, and I haven't done a lot of comment compiling on the mixed waste landfill between then, but I'm glad to be reminded.
If you turn with me, please, to DOE Sandia Exhibit 16.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm looking at, after the cover page, it's actually labeled at the top, page 1.
Mm-hmm.
You have that before you?
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the commenter ID H,
Mm-hmm.
it indicates Citizen Action, New Mexico, comma, Susan Dayton, comments compiled by Paul Robinson, Southwest Research and Information Center. That's you, right?
Yeah, but as I remember, I was more the note taker and compiler than generating comments of my own. As you see, the comments are mentioned as from other sources rather than.
Okay, it doesn't matter to me whether or not you didn't comment at all or you commented on behalf of Citizen Action. The fact is you didn't comment on the trigger levels for VOCs, right?
I didn't make any comments of my own on
And
that.
so you didn't make any suggestions about what that level ought to be set at, right?
Not at that time. No.
You obviously knew that the opportunity was available to you at that time, right?
I wasn't paying attention to the deadlines for the various post-2004 hearing because I wasn't working on the subject. I didn't have a client. I didn't have resources to work on it.
Okay, but you compiled comments on behalf of Citizen Action.
I don't. There are other organizations besides Citizen Action who have commented, and the comments that I compiled were from other individuals and organizations than Citizen Action.
Turn please back to Exhibit 21 in that notebook.
Sure.
Okay, we were looking at page 5-2, and we talked about the resample. The next step is to notify NMED, right?
Correct.
And then there is implement further investigation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's an investigation report, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the NMED reviews and determines what the final action is, right?
Well, there's conditions on that step, but yes, eventually NMED determines final action.
Table 5.2-1 on page 5-5. Do you have that before you?
Yes.
If you look at Vado zone, the monitoring parameter is VOCs and soil vapor. You see that?
5-5.
It's a table 5.2-1.
Yes.
Vado zone, VOCs and soil vapor. Are you with me?
Mm-hmm.
Say it again, please.
I'm looking at the column that's, or the row that's labeled Vado zone, VOCs, and soil vapor.
Mm-hmm.
The trigger level for PCE is 20 parts per million, right?
Correct.
The trigger level for TCE is 20 parts per million, right?
Correct.
Looking back at DOE Sandia Exhibit 25, you have that?
DOE Exhibit 25.
It's the one I handed out.
Oh, okay. No wonder it's not in the binder. Yes.
If the trigger level is 20 parts per million, The highest detection we have on here is 0.56, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's less than 1/20th, right?
Correct.
Less than 5% of the trigger level. So there weren't any exceedances of the trigger level, right?
Sounds like a really badly chosen trigger level because the release is confirmed.
Now, just need you to confirm that it is less than 5% of the trigger level, right?
I just did, and I will not change my opinion. I agree with your math.
Okay, good. The ultimate concern is groundwater, right?
I believe the ultimate concern is preventing releases.
Okay, well, we have standards for groundwater, right?
Correct.
And there's some standards for TCE and PCE, is that right?
That's my understanding.
Do you know what that is?
5 micrograms per liter.
That's right. Do you know what the trigger level is for PCE and TCE in the LTMMP?
Yes.
What
It's
is it?
1/2 of that.
2.5 micrograms per
Yes.
liter. There was some testimony yesterday, I believe you were the questioner, about samples from April and June, right? Do you recall that?
Do you recall that, sir? It was a question.
April and June?
Of 2014, there were samples of groundwater that...
Oh, yes, yes. Table 7.1 of the same report that this Exhibit 25 is from, yes.
Right, and those detections were shown below the PQL, right?
Correct.
Which is 1.0 microgram per liter, right?
I believe so.
And so the detections in April and June were below the trigger level, right?
Yes.
And certainly below the standard, right?
Yes.
In October of 2014, there was another round of sampling of groundwater, right?
That's my understanding.
And there was testimony that said that there were no detections of PCE and TCE.
That's correct.
If you could find the notebook there that's been labeled NMED, Notice of Intent, and there should be an NMED Exhibit 15.
I think I've got that a little easier here. NMED. No, I don't have an NMED binder, so it won't be a moment.
That's fine.
Okay, thanks.
Do you have NMED Exhibit 15 before you?
Yes.
What do you understand this document to be?
This document is a table of Henry's Law's calculation, 1 page, December 2014 soil vapor monitoring results, 17 pages, and October 2014 soil vapor monitoring results, 15 pages.
And I believe you just testified to this. You have some issues with the way that it's done, right?
No, I didn't have issues with the way it was done. I have issues with the finality of the conclusions that are drawn based on this very limited data set.
Well, that's helpful to understand. For the data that we do have, Mr. Moats is showing here essentially that given the concentrations of VOCs in the soil, that there's not a concern with the groundwater standard being exceeded, correct?
That's my understanding. Even though the levels in the soil are 50% or higher percentage of the vapor concentrations, he said that there was no risk, and I think that was too extreme, and that's a reason for more data to find out more than just these 2 sampling episodes have provided.
It's based on this this effort was based on the samples that we do have to date, right?
Well, it's the, I don't know if this is based on both samples or one sample. I can't tell whether the soil vapor concentration listed, 0.668 and 0.471 on the right-hand column. Those numbers are not numbers that I find on Sandy Exhibit 25, which you handed me, which is the summary of the data from those two sampling suites.
Well,
So I
Yeah.
don't really know.
we can leave it to the testimony of Mr. Moats as to what those numbers come from. Those concentrations that you just listed are actually higher than any values that are shown for PCE and TCE on DOE Sandia Exhibit 25, right?
That's correct.
We heard from Mr. Moats that based on the experience at the chem waste landfill, it took approximately 7 years to get to groundwater. Do you recall that?
I do.
When did the mixed waste landfill close?
Well, I think as Dr. Dinwiddie said, it's never been closed.
When did they stop putting waste in it?
I believe it was the late 90s, late 80s.
1988, does that sound correct to you?
Mm-hmm.
7 years from 1988, 1995, is my math okay?
Excellent. Yes.
And it's now been 27 years, right?
Correct.
So if Mr. Moats is correct, you'd expect to see concentrations in the groundwater by now?
Only if you expected the release to have occurred at the time the waste placement ended, but I don't think that's reasonable. The containers were so poor that it could have occurred at any time after that, and there could have been some of the VOCs in 59, no more added after 63. I just don't know what the sequence is for either the loading of the volatile organics into the landfill, much less when the releases began.
Okay. And Council, I'm going to ask that we try to move things along. I think we're about to lose our court reporter, so, and I think
enough.
she's well past what should be expected, so.
I have just a few more questions. Mr. Robinson, you also had suggestions about trying to improve the fate and transport model, right?
Yes.
And that also struck me as a good idea. Now, every 5 years, there's a 5-year report, right?
Yes.
One thing that gets done in that 5-year report is a reevaluation of the fate and transport model, right?
Possibly.
Well, it has to be evaluated, correct?
Yes. That is, evaluation is not a very substantial commitment in my mind, and based on the new data, I think that responding more quickly than on 5 years is reasonable and appropriate. And as the various people have talked about, the 5-year review of the cover, 5-year becomes 15 with delays and other procedures. So prompt revision would be more appropriate. If it's only every 5 years, that's at least a revision.
You understand it's due in 2019? You're
Yes.
nodding your head, that's yes?
So I think it's unwise to wait 5 years to revise the model with this new data suite.
You have already explained that, thank you. Please turn to NMED Exhibit 8.
NMED Exhibit 8.
No, I'm sorry, I'm looking for NMED Exhibit 7 at page 8.
Exhibit 7, page 8. Okay. I'm there.
You had some issues with the help model, right?
I had some issues with the use of the help model in the development of the ET cover?
Lines 8 through 10, I'm going to read those. HELP 3 was used to predict infiltration through the ET cover, and UNSAT H and VS2DT were run for comparison with the HELP 3 modeling results. You see that?
Yes.
Other models were used to help validate and support the HELP model, correct?
Correct. There's no real indication of what was done with those models to validate. The EPA report on the ET transpiration covers said it was the percolation portion of the HELP model that may not have been appropriate, and that would have been part of what was used to predict infiltration, the word on line 9, and it's unclear what was done with those other models compared to the HELP 3 run. But I don't doubt what the report says, that other models were used.
It's unclear to you because you haven't studied that, right?
Well, it's unclear to me because it's unclear in the statement.
You haven't studied that, right?
Studied what?
The way in which the HELP 3, UNSAT H, VS2DT models were used in connection? That's not something you've evaluated?
Correct. And neither has the witness.
Well,
The witness was just summarizing what was in a report that she was provided.
Let's stick to questions.
Yeah. Ms. Dare did evaluate the ET cover, right?
What I understood from her was that she evaluated the construction, design, and whether the as-built reflected the design, not the performance or the underlying bases for the design.
And I can certainly look at her testimony.
And she also testified that she was comfortable with the way that modeling worked, correct?
Oh, she was comfortable with everything, yes.
No further questions.
Okay, NMED.
We have no questions for this witness.
Okay. At this late hour, any questions from the public for Mr. Robinson? We have one person. Any others? Two. I'm sorry. Okay, let's start, Ms. Greenwald.
Mr. Robinson, is this working? Is it working? Yeah, okay. In 2014, there were 2 rounds of testing in the Vados underneath the mixed waste landfill. Is that correct?
2 rounds of testing of the Vados zone for volatile organics, yes.
Uh-huh. One was in September and one was in October?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Were those figures basically the same for September and October?
They were all in the same range of about 0.1 to 0.8 part per million, but there was variation within them.
Did you notice a decrease or increase in the amounts of VOCs from those tests?
I noticed that the levels at the lower portions of the monitoring wells were higher than the levels in the shallower portions for the 3 deep wells.
And so was there an increase between September and October? Was there any increase at all?
In my testimony, the table I included, and also on the slide, slide 7, I highlighted the October data, which was higher than the September data. So wherever under the PCE column, for example, under SVO3, on the left side are the September, on the right side of the dash is the October. And for each, for the 50 foot, it was lower in October than September. And for the 100, 200, 300, and 400, it was higher. So I reflected that in the table as I prepared it.
Thank you very much. You and I and others have been concerned for some time with contamination of the Sandia site to Harris Arroyo. Is that correct?
Yes?
Could you tell us a figure telling us the amount of contaminated water under that site, Harris Arroyo?
Could you ask the question again?
Yes. How much contamination is there at Tierras Arroyo, and what kind of contamination is it?
I think you're asking about the Tierras Arroyo groundwater
That's
site,
correct.
which is one of the sites that was mentioned as a location of groundwater contamination at Sandia, I think by Mr. Moats. The amount of water that was released in above the Tierras Arroyo groundwater plume is in the billions of gallons. I prepared a report on this reviewing Sandia's data. There were many liquid waste disposal systems that operated under the Tech Area 1, which is above the Tierras Arroyo groundwater plume.
And what are the contaminants there? Are the main contaminants?
Let me,
Mr. Hangoff, sir, I'm sorry. I don't recall this being part of any testimony presented previously by Mr. Robinson, either verbally.
I'll get to that. I promise you, in just a moment.
Ms. Merrill, is there any way we can you ask him if certain contaminants are there? Maybe that might jog his memory instead of having him look
Was
it
there
up.
PCE and TCE involved?
and nitrate, as I remember.
Okay. So have we ever brought concerns about this site to the New Mexico Environment Department?
Yes.
And were we promised a meeting with Sandia National Labs, the Environment Department, and the public concerning this contamination?
I have heard you say that. Yeah, that yes, the ED's bureau chief did make that commitment.
And how long, do you remember how long ago he made that commitment and how long we've been waiting for that meeting?
I think that we're talking 2013. I don't think we're talking 2014.
Several years.
Correct.
Okay. Dr. Dinwiddie talked about plastic bags being put in the trenches at the mixed waste landfill. Do you have any, is there any reason to think that those bags would all break at one time if they did break?
No, not to my knowledge.
Mm-hmm. You had said, we've heard over and over again that soon there will be a 5-year review of whether Sandia mixed waste landfill should be excavated. How long has it been since the cover has been put on the mixed waste landfill? Do you know?
2009, I believe, is when the cover was installed, so that's 6 years.
And when will the 5-year review be?
I believe the 5-year review of the is 2019 based on the 2014 approval of the long-term monitoring and maintenance plan. So it's 5 years from the approval of that plan rather than 5 years from the order in 2005.
Does this history give you any confidence that this review won't be delayed?
The decision was delayed, so I am confident that it was delayed from 2005. Am I confident that it will be delayed again beyond 2019?
No, are you confident that it won't be delayed?
I'm not confident that it won't be delayed. I think that there are conditions and variations that could occur that might allow changes to that schedule, but I don't know that any of them are in the works, and I don't know what the probability of a change is, but it's a possibility.
So you've heard testimony by Ms. Reiser that it's been 22 years between permits for Sandia National Laboratory. And then we've heard testimony that it will be 10 years before there is another permit hearing. Are you confident that there will be a hearing, another permit hearing in 10 years? Are you confident in that?
My experience is that the 10-year renewal period is seldom met, that the key deadline for the permittee is filing the notice of intent to revise or the revised application. That's due nominally 180 days before the expiration of the permit. As long as the renewal application is filed, the permit extends in force. And that's what occurred here. That's occurred at many RCRA and other permits at the state. It's very difficult to stay within that 10-year deadline, in my experience, for the state agency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robinson.
Mr. Hunter.
I have to get this thing to work. There we go. Okay, my question relates to the chem waste dump. It appears, Mr. Robinson, that this is very well characterized from this diagram. Mm-hmm. Would you say that plume was very well characterized, and how many monitoring wells were required to develop this model?
I don't know how many wells were used to characterize the model. It's looks detailed. It's got much more detail than the long-term protection of groundwater cross-section from the mixed waste landfill fact sheets. But the water table in this figure that you're pointing to on page 9 of my presentation shows a water table at 500 feet. And volatile organic compounds were found in that water table exceeding the 5 microgram per liter standard. But this doesn't show the plume reaching the water table. It shows the plume in that 200 to 300 foot level where there's a advection dominated, diffusion dominated layer, salty, sandy clay layer. So it's detailed, but it doesn't show the plume as it reached groundwater.
And this is slide 10. This vertical profile also suggests a lot of detail.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this is accurate? And again, the question is, how many monitoring wells were required to develop this level of detail?
Now that figure appears to show the number of wells used. You can hear me?
Face this way if you can.
It's hard for me to look at it. So the figure shows the number of wells used in drawing the fence diagram. So it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's the ends just off the figure. So it looks like there's 5 to 7 wells used to draw that fence diagram.
And how many wells are there at the mixed waste landfill?
Well, there's 4 monitoring wells that are shown in the figure on the right, bottom right of that figure you're looking at. Those are the only 4 wells that reach groundwater. The soil vapor monitoring wells, they reach 80% to groundwater. They just get to 400 feet.
And this also has a longitudinal aspect to it, right? And this was developed over a period of years. Would that be correct?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by longitudinal aspect, but certainly developed over a number of years.
Okay, and we don't have those years yet with the mixed waste landfill.
Well, we have as much time going by as at the mixed waste landfill. They were started in the 50s, issues and RCRA responses beginning at the same time based on the adoption of RCRA and implementation. So it's the greater contamination. It's the VOCs in groundwater that got the chem waste landfill cleaned up, excavated, as Mr. Motes makes clear. And so showing that VOCs maybe have reached groundwater here is a reason to do more work and maybe respond in the way the base did to do voluntary corrective measures at the mixed waste landfill.
Mr. Robinson, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone, especially Cheryl, our core reporter. We will see everyone. Yes.